When I heard the clinic's front door creak the way it always does at 7 sharp, my breath caught in my chest because I realized something about that sound wasn't routine. It was deeper, heavier, as if the Montana pine frame itself had flinched. I was alone. Marcy, my tech, wouldn't arrive for another half hour. I'd already switched on the overheads, set a fresh pot of coffee gurgling, and lined up the morning syringes by habit more than thought. 2 decades in this building make motions automatic. Outside the window, Jackson was waking like any other Tuesday, snowmelt dripping from eaves, pickup engines coughing, a raven scolding nobody in particular. Normal. Safe. I turned, clipboard in hand, fully prepared to greet a rancher and his limping collie. Instead, the pen slipped through my fingers and clattered to the linoleum. There, filling the doorway from jam to jam, stood a grizzly bear, shoulders like overturned boulders, winter coat still shaggy in late spring, the dull gold of early sun laying a halo over fur-drenched brown with meltwater. For a second, I couldn't breathe at all. My ribs locked around my lungs the way a trap snaps around bone. The bear did not roar. He did not rear. He did not charge. He simply looked at me, looked the way an old ranch hand might size up the new vet before trusting him with a prize bull. His eyes were not predatory amber. They were dark, steady, and God help me thoughtful. My first instinct, run for the back exit, battled instantly with the oath I took as a doctor. But adrenaline plays tricks, my calves twitched, my palms sweated, yet I found myself frozen behind the counter, transfixed by a gaze that felt uncomfortably human. It said, "I have come for a reason. See me." The bear drew one monumental breath, ribs expanding under the thick pelt. Then slowly, deliberately, he stepped across the threshold. The door eased shut behind him on the damper, sealing the world outside, locking us together in a hush so complete I heard the second hand on the lobby clock trip forward. His claws clicked once on tile, the only sharp thing about him. No growl. No snap of teeth. Just that impossible composure, as though he'd studied waiting room etiquette. 1,000 half-formed thoughts thrashed in my skull: call fish and game, locate the trank gun, pray. Yet none fit what my senses told me. Firing a dart into this chest would be as obscene as shooting a pilgrim at the church door. The bear took another step. Sunlight through glass caught the ridge of scar tissue along his muzzle, ghost white against brown. Old injury, long healed. So he'd survived men before. My mind raced through every case file, every anecdote of human bear encounters, searching for a precedent. A wild grizzly walks into a building by choice? Nothing. Bears raid dumpsters, they don't queue for appointments. Still he came, each footfall measured. 5 paces carried him to the reception desk. He lowered his rear haunches with the creaking grace of a weary ranch dog and sat, front paws squared, head lifted, eyes never leaving mine. That sitting down, like a patient prepared to explain symptoms, hit me harder than any roar could have. It broke the spell of fear and replaced it with raw, unfiltered awe. My pulse drummed not with panic but with recognition. The animal understood the concept of asking. I worked my mouth, found no words, reached for the handset on instinct, then stopped. Who would believe me? Even if they came racing, lights and sirens, what would they do, drag him out at gunpoint? The bear shifted, weight tilting off his left foreleg. Only then did I notice the mat of dried blood between long guard hairs, the crimson turning almost black where fur met skin. He raised the paw delicately and placed it on the shiny white tile as though presenting evidence. A jagged steel bite lay sunk behind the pad, the serrated jaws of a small game spring trap, cruel and rust-flecked. Pain must have been a wildfire along his nerves, yet he made no sound beyond a low, contained rumble, less threat than determination to hold still. That sight pierced something soft inside my chest. The Hippocratic reflex took over, louder than survival instinct. I moved from behind the counter, hands open, voice low, narrating my every motion the way I would to a spooked colt. Easy, big fella. I see it, we'll get you right. Ridiculous, talking to a bear, but language soothed me if not him. Step by step I crossed the space between us, hearing my own heartbeat thud in my ears like hoofbeats on dry earth. He watched but did not flinch, not even when I knelt within reach of jaws capable of crushing a bowling ball. Close now, I could smell his winter-thick coat, a musk of spruce resin and something coppery blood, yes, but also the cold scent of mountain wind. I thought the next moment would decide whether I lived or died. I told myself if I could just examine the wound I might. Well, I didn't finish the thought because logic faltered under weight of the impossible. I expected him to tense, to swipe, to reconsider this madness and bolt for the trees. I truly believed the story would end right there, with a frightened bear turning tail, leaving only claw marks on the vinyl and an anecdote nobody would accept. I thought that would be the end of it, but instead, he shifted closer and lowered that massive head as if granting permission, as if doctor's orders meant something across species lines. And that was the moment my world, neat and clinical, cracked open like ice under spring thaw. The grizzly settled in front of the reception desk so deliberately it reminded me of a tired grandfather easing into a pew. His rear haunches touched tile with a soft thump, knees folding forward until he sat square and dignified, forelegs braced like pillars. From muzzle to rump he had to push 8 feet, maybe 9, an alpha male in the absolute prime of his mass. Muscles rippled beneath winter coat that still clung in uneven drifts, each motion shifting waves of chocolate and amber fur. Along his left shoulder a crescent scar, long ago silvered, cut a pale groove. Another, smaller one ran behind the right ear, the notched legacy of a rifle round that must have grazed him seasons back. Every mark said survivor. Yet the clinic fell so quiet I wondered if the world beyond our 4 walls had simply ceased. The thermostat's blower cut off, even the wall clock, steadfast metronome of kennel calls and checkups, seemed to hesitate between ticks. I caught myself holding breath, lungs stinging. It felt sacrilegious to make the slightest sound while that animal sat, regal and unhurried, in a place built for terriers and tabbies. He met my stare unflinchingly. Not a challenge, not a dare, just a straight channel of consciousness from dark irises to the center of my spine. There was no glint of hunger, no cut-off squint that signals imminent bluff charge. The look was almost administrative, as if we were about to discuss terms. I thought of the way old timber men speak with nods instead of words. The bear's face wore the same unruffled certainty. Easy now, I murmured, barely audible even to myself, hand hovering near the drawer where tranks waited in neat foam slots. My fingers twitched but never closed on a dart. Firing one felt suddenly barbaric, like tasering a priest in mid-prayer. Up close the nuances of his bulk hit harder. His forearms were the thickness of fence posts, yet the claws at each tip curved with surgical precision, yellow ivory blades flecked dark where road dust and pine pitch had collected. A dusting of ice crystals still clung to belly fur, sparkling star-white before melting into wet diamonds on the floor. The clinic's fluorescent strips painted a corridor of light across his back, and in it I saw faint movement. His hide quivered where healed scar tissue tugged against new muscle fiber. Old pain, born in silence. Instinct argued that any grizzly inside human walls would pace, sniff, swipe at cabinets, overturn exam stools. But he sat motionless, leaving only the slow bellows of breath to prove he was living flesh and not myth made solid. I realized I could distinguish 2 notes in that respiration, a deep draw, resonant as a church organ, and a shorter hiss that escaped with effort. Pain somewhere, throttling the exhale. A notion, ludicrous, impossible, sprang fully formed. He came here on purpose. My rational brain barked that bears do not plan pilgrimages, do not correlate buildings with relief. Yet the certainty tunneled deeper than logic, striking bedrock in the gut. 20 years of patching torn paws had taught me the vocabulary of suffering. I knew what it looked like when a creature surrendered pride in hope of mercy. The grizzly mirrored every shepherd mix that ever limped through my door, head lowered just enough to say, "Help me if you can." Still, doubt rattled around my skull like a loose marble. I can't be watching this. Any second he'll pivot, crash through the window, vanish into alley snowdrifts, and I'll swear this was a stress dream. The thought steadied me. If I expected flight, I might be ready for it. So I waited. 1 heartbeat. 2. 3. I noticed my own pulse sinking to his slow inhales, a rhythm older than stethoscopes. The bear's ears twitched at some distant truck backfiring outside, but he did not rise. I glanced at the exit again, half anticipating the sudden turn of that massive head, the lunge toward freedom. It didn't come. Instead, his right shoulder dipped forward. The grizzly shifted weight off his left foreleg, the motion revealing something I hadn't registered from behind the counter. Dark fur parted, and a wetter, shinier patch caught the sterile light, fresh blood, not the rust-red dregs of an ancient scab. The limb trembled as he extended it, claws scraping faintly. And then I saw it. A ragged crescent of steel teeth clamped hard into flesh, jaw springs twisted by sheer force but unbroken. A small game trap, illegal, cruel, and utterly out of place on a bear this size. The metal had chewed deep, edges hidden beneath swollen tissue. With each breath his pulse pushed another bead of crimson between bent tines. My mouth shaped a soundless oath. All illusions of routine disintegrated. I stood face to face with an intelligence that had crossed the threshold of human space to display a wound like a badge. For one stunned instant I believed he might finally give up on me, turn, lumber off, disappear the same silent way he'd arrived, leaving only a blood-flecked trail and a story no one would credit. I thought that was what would happen, but instead he let the mangled paw droop toward me as if offering it across a fragile truce line, and the weight of that gesture pressed every last doubt into dust. The bear eased his mutilated foreleg forward as though lowering a sacred object onto an altar. Claws the size of pocketknives brushed the tile, then splayed to steady him. Only now, with the limb fully revealed, did I understand the scale of his agony. A semicircle of rust-brown steel fangs bit into flesh and tendon just above the pad, spring jaws forged for coyotes, not a 600-pound grizzly. They had snapped shut, then twisted, shredding tissue into a swollen collar of purple and black. Every shift of weight squeezed fresh blood through matted fur, thin and bright as cranberry juice. The sight punched the breath from my lungs. Some part of me wanted to dart for the supply cabinet, grab ketamine, lidocaine, bolt cutters, anything. Another part screamed to back away, give the animal room, call wildlife officers, let professionals with tranquilizer rifles take over. Those instincts slammed into each other, ricocheting inside my skull. Duty's ward, veterinarian versus fragile mortal. I could almost feel the hierarchy of needs stacking itself. First, do no harm, but also stay alive. One swipe from his free paw would split me open like a feed sack. I'd seen what claws that length could do to lodge doors and century-old pines. Working grizzlies in the field required darts, traps, whole teams. Here I was, unarmed but for a stethoscope around my neck. A single step closer and I'd be inside the arc of those arms, inside the place textbooks politely call crush range. My heart hammered so hard I tasted copper. If he wants to end me, I thought, I'll be gone before the next second hand clicks. Yet my feet refused retreat. The bear's eyes, nearly black, rimmed with sun-bleached lashes, held mine in a lock that felt less like threat than beseeching. Pain radiated off him in waves I could almost hear, a subsonic hum that vibrated my teeth. But behind the misery burned something steadier, intent. He had chosen the clinic, chosen me, chosen this moment to gamble his life on trust. I crouched, low and slow, palms facing him so he could read my empty hands. "You're hurting, big guy," I whispered, voice tremoring enough to blur consonants. "Let's see what we can do." I slid a foot forward. The bear flicked one ear, but didn't growl. Another foot. My knees shook, sweat chilled the small of my back. At 5 feet away I could smell the wound, metallic, sweet rot infection hiding beneath the iron bite of fresh blood. Flies would have swarmed had the season been warmer. Instead, a single bead of pus clung to fur and quivered like a tear. I swallowed hard and willed my pulse to slow. "I need tools," I said aloud, maybe to him, maybe to myself. Then I backed out the way I'd come, centimeter by centimeter, never turning my spine to him. At the drug cart my hands finally found speed, snatching vials and gauze, the bolt cutter we keep for dogs stuck in chain link. The steel looked pitifully small compared to the trap jaws. Adrenaline made the metal rattle against the countertop. I drew up a syringe of concentrated medetomidine, enough to drowse a bull elk, and hesitated. To deliver it I would need skin contact, a pinch of hide, any flinch could turn fatal. I returned to the lobby, kit cradled like a newborn. The bear hadn't moved. Only his injured paw trembled from the effort of holding weight evenly. I knelt again, this time so close a fleck of his breath warmed my cheek. His nostrils twitched at the alcohol scent on my gloves. "Easy," I murmured. The needle's point hovered a handspan from his shoulder. If he lunged, the motion would end where it started, in memory. I drew one more breath for nerve, then noticed his gaze. Wide. Unblinking. Not glare, not challenge permission. An almost imperceptible dip of the massive head broke the stare, like a nod between equals. I couldn't say why, but the syringe lowered. Sedative felt like an insult to the covenant forming in that silence. Risk cocked against gratitude and, impossibly, gratitude won. "All right," I exhaled. "No drugs." I reached for the trap instead. Close up, the jaws were worse, serrated edges buried in fat and tendon, barbs curled inward so removal meant fresh tearing. I slid the bolt cutter's jaw around one hinge. The bear exhaled a low, seismic grunt, neither approval nor protest, more a resigned do it. I braced the handles, prayed the steel would shear, and squeezed with everything my arms owned. The cutters clanged, the hinge resisted, groaned, then popped. One jaw sprang free, metal clattering to tile. Blood surged. I pressed gauze, felt tremors ripple through his forelimb, the vibration of withheld roar. But he held. He held. For an instant I thought that courage, his and mine, had spent itself. I imagined the bear wrenching back, instincts reclaimed, exit chosen, leaving me shaking among bloody towels and disbelief. I thought I wouldn't dare press further, but there was something else in those eyes, something that said we were only halfway to salvation, and somehow that silent plea dragged me closer instead of driving me away. I hustled back to the treatment bay like a sleepwalker sprinting through a dream, every limb filled with wet cement. Stainless steel drawers clanged open under gloved fists that shook so hard I nearly dropped the basin. I grabbed the biggest irrigation syringe we owned, 2 liters of warmed saline, a stack of sterile pads thick as a phone book, chlorhexidine scrub, suture kit, hemostats, elastic gauze, vet wrap. Last came the lidocaine vial, habit more than plan. I hadn't decided if I'd dare inject it. When I returned to the lobby, the bear still knelt on his haunches, trap half-clamped but neutralized, mangled paw leaking steady beads onto the tile. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud, pistol-shot echoes in the hush. He tracked me with those fathom-dark eyes but made no move to retreat, not even when I set the instrument tray beside him and the wheels squeaked. "Okay, partner," I breathed, voice wobbling. "Next part might sting." I could feel my pulse in my teeth, my knees threatened to buckle with every heartbeat. Still, the inner scaffolding of training took over. I drew saline into the syringe, angled the nozzle. First contact, my left hand slid beneath the injured limb, just enough to lift it clear of the floor. The paw was heavier than any canine's, dense with muscle, the pads calloused like truck tire rubber. Heat poured off the wound, infection already roared beneath battered tissue. The bear's ears flicked back, not in anger but anticipation. Then he let the weight settle into my palm, a deliberate surrender that rattled my bones more than a roar ever could. I flushed the gash. Pink-red fluid splashed across plastic sheeting I'd thrown down, sizzling faintly where antiseptic met raw nerve. The bear's entire frame tensed, quivering through my wrist like live current, yet he didn't jerk away. His breath thundered over my bent head, warm and pungent with spruce buds and distant carrion. A winter diet survived, not chosen. Almost there, I murmured, more prayer than promise. I reached for the chlorhexidine swabs, dabbed the edges of torn flesh. When the cold solution bit, he chuffed once, a low gust that ruffled my hair. Instinct screamed move, but my grip held. A ribbon of time stretched as though the walls, the floor, the world waited to see if trust could outmuscle pain. Then his eyes met mine. Up close, the irises weren't black at all but a deep, storm cloud brown spiraling into amber flecks. In them I read a question, maybe even a memory, some dim recognition that 2-legged creatures hurt him once, yet one might help him now. He looked at me like I was one of his own. The knowledge rooted me to the tile, drove every tremor from my fingers. I trimmed away ragged tissue, swab by careful swab, until blood ran clear and the grotesque puncture became a wound I could name, chart, mend. Lidocaine? The syringe hovered, but again I stopped. To infiltrate anesthetic, I'd have to pierce inflamed margins, one more needle in already brutalized flesh. My gut said no. Instead, I packed a ribbon of antibiotic gel between torn layers, laid a pressure pad, wrapped the limb from wrist to elbow in elastic purple. The bear sniffed each new texture, never flinching, only the occasional jaw flex betraying how close I worked to the tipping point. Minutes, or maybe years, later, I secured the final strip of vet wrap with a snap. Blood had slowed to an ooze, the paw now swaddled in color cheerful enough for a children's ward. I cradled it a moment longer, feeling the tremor in his tendons settle, then lowered it to the floor. My shoulders slumped, lungs gulped air like I'd surfaced from deep water. That should have been the end. Any sane grizzly, job done, would lumber straight for daylight, crash through glass if needed, flee this den of chemical smells and electric hum. I half rose, arms sweeping toward the open doorway as though inviting a human patient to the lobby exit. "All set, big guy." My voice cracked on free. He didn't move. Instead, he shifted weight back onto the bandaged paw, testing, assessing, then sat again, exactly where he'd waited before, gaze still fixed to mine. The clinic clock ticked 3 stiff beats. He blinked once, slow and solemn, like a judge requesting the next piece of evidence. A strange hush filled my chest where a heartbeat ought to thud. I'd given him everything the moment demanded, sterile clean, pressure wrap. A road to healing. What else could he possibly want? Doubt coiled up my spine. Had I missed a second injury? Poison? God, internal bleeding? I scanned his hulking frame, suddenly frantic for signs. I thought the session was over, thought he would finally rise and leave me shaking in the aftershock. But the bear remained, immovable as granite, and in that unwavering stare I realized my work, our communion, was only beginning. The bear's refusal to leave hooked something deep inside my professional reflexes, the same compulsion that makes a surgeon double-check stitches even after the blood has stopped. I slid the instrument cart closer and forced myself to view him not as an omen wrapped in fur, but as a patient whose chart wasn't finished. "Let's have another look, partner." I murmured the words the way I would to a nervous horse, hoping cadence alone might soothe. He neither growled nor shuffled away. Instead, to my astonishment, he angled his head and offered the bandaged limb a fraction higher, as if granting permission for round two. I trimmed the wrap and peeled it back. Fresh crimson haloed the gauze, but the bleed had slowed to a sluggish pulse. Still, capillary ooze could drown tissue if I left it. I unpacked a hemostat, clamped the stubborn vessel, and flushed with chilled saline. The bear's shoulder twitched once, muscle bunching like a triggered piston, yet he stayed grounded. Not one growl vibrated his throat. I'd sedated mastiffs that fought harder over a nail trim. I slid cramped fingers under the pad to check for hidden debris. There, wedged deep between metacarpals, lay a sliver of rusted steel the bolt cutters hadn't freed. I caught it with forceps, tugged. The shard came free with a tiny metallic scream. Blood sheeted down my glove. The bear exhaled a rumble, low but controlled. More the groan of a warrior having an arrow snapped off than the snarl of a beast. A moment later his breathing steadied, deliberate, as though he'd made the conscious choice to master pain. The room's fluorescent lights hummed. My own heartbeat eased from gallop to trot. Somewhere in the distance a snowplow clattered over ice. Yet the bear kept his gaze locked to mine, no longer pleading, simply present. Recognition flickered behind his eyes each time I switched instruments, as if he understood these tools fought on his side. I treated elk gut shot by poachers, foxes gashed by barbed wire, a rogue moose hit by a truck. All of them thrashed, kicked, screamed. None behaved like this, silent, stoic, strangely collaborative. A memory surfaced, the wildlife rehab conference in Bozeman last year, a researcher describing how some primates present injuries to trusted caretakers. But grizzlies aren't primates, my skeptic side insisted. Another voice, older, softer, answered, maybe trust doesn't care about taxonomy. The gash finally lay clean. No shards, no sludge, flesh trimmed to pink edges ready to knit. I threaded black nylon through a curved needle, the kind built for thick hide, and set to work. 12 stitches, precise and even. With each pass, the bear's shoulder rose and fell, but otherwise he remained marble still. I pressed antibiotic cream, layered fresh gauze, then spun a final length of vet wrap, this time bright forest green. Somewhere between knotting the bandage and taping the tail, wonder eclipsed fear. I wasn't treating an apex predator anymore. I was stewarding a covenant older than language. I straightened, wiped sweat from my brow with the crook of my arm, and stepped back. That's the best I can give you, big guy. My voice cracked in the hush. You're free. I gestured toward the doorway again, a tired usher at the end of a midnight show. For a beat, he did nothing. Then, with deliberate grace, he shifted weight onto the freshly wrapped paw. I braced, half expecting the leg to buckle. It held. He rose, all 600 pounds unfolding like a slow earthquake, and turned toward the exit. Relief flooded me, sweet and dizzying. Good. He'll head for the forest, sleep, heal. Story over. I had already bent to gather bloody gauze when an odd hush drew my gaze back up. The bear had stopped halfway to the door. He faced the wall of framed photographs, snapshots of every rescue the clinic ever celebrated. Bald eagles released, fawns bottle-fed, fox kits stitched and set free. His enormous head tilted, studying those images the way patrons linger over chapel frescoes. Then he did something so quietly profound my breath snagged. He lifted his uninjured paw, huge, lethal, steady, and pressed it against the photograph of a black-tailed deer with splinted legs, a case from 3 winters past. The gesture was impossibly gentle. Pads touched glass, claws suspended millimeters away so as not to scratch. He held the contact 2 heartbeats, 3, long enough for meaning to crystallize like frost. Gratitude? A salute from one survivor to another? I couldn't name it, but tears blurred my vision. I thought that after pain eased he would bolt into morning snow and never look back. But instead, the grizzly offered that silent benediction to the wall of healed creatures, and in that slender, inexplicable moment I understood. He didn't just receive help. He acknowledged it, as if our fragile species boundary had thinned to a transparent veil. The bear's paw lingered on the photograph a moment longer, then drifted down. He pivoted, slow, deliberate, and faced me again. Before I could parse what he meant by that silent salute, he did something that cleaved the remaining distance between worlds. He lifted his other foreleg, the uninjured one, and extended it into empty air the way a child reaches across a table for a parent's hand. For a heartbeat I froze, baffled. That limb bore no trap, no blood, only thick fur dusted with road grit. Yet the gesture was unmistakable. Treat this one too. A preventative request, or perhaps a ritual of symmetry my human mind couldn't quite decode. Whatever the reason, it shattered any lingering doubt that what passed between us was coincidence. A tremor rippled through my knees. He's asking, I thought, wonder and terror wrestling in equal measure. You trust me? I whispered, voice barely vapor. The words felt fragile beside his living magnitude, yet they answered something in his gaze. The pupils widened fractionally, softening dark brown into liquid mahogany. I gathered fresh supplies with hands that shook so badly gauze wrappers rattled like dry leaves. Fear didn't vanish. It threaded every nerve, a hot filament humming under the skin. At the same time, a current of reverence coursed just as fiercely, lifting the hairs on my arms until I felt charged, almost holy, like a barefoot pilgrim touching the threshold of an ancient shrine. I am terrified, my body screamed. I am honored, my soul replied. The two truths coexisted, each sharpening the other. I knelt. The bear placed his sound paw into my gloved palms with the gravity of a ceremonial offering. No trap mangled this flesh, but weeks of winter roaming had cracked pads and packed gravel into tiny fissures. I flushed them with warm saline, watching bits of grit swirl away. He neither flinched nor pulled back. He studied me as intently as I studied him, head cocked as though memorizing the choreography of care. Almost done? I murmured, dabbing chlorhexidine into each crevice. When the antiseptic stung, he huffed, a breathy expulsion more sigh than protest, but held steadier than any sedated dog. I trimmed a splintered claw, filed ragged edges, smoothed pad calluses with salve. The intimacy of it shook me. I, a mortal of pliant skin and fragile bone, tending weapons that could eviscerate sheet metal. Yet the thought of his strength no longer threatened. It humbled. Throughout the procedure our eyes met again and again, a silent pulse bridging hunter and healer, wilderness and sterile lamplight. Each time the connection lengthened, pulling me deeper into a certainty that had no place in textbooks. Somewhere beneath instinct and beyond language lay a plane where species could meet, if only for the span of one slow heartbeat. When every crack shone clean and medicated, I wrapped the paw in fresh white gauze for warmth more than protection. My hands steadied at last, as if muscle memory accepted this new reality. Yes, bears can volunteer for treatment. Yes, trust can outweigh fear. I set the paw gently on the floor. The bear tested it, shifted, flexed claws, pressed weight, and rumbled low approval that vibrated straight through my rib cage. I sank back on my heels, adrenaline ebbing until exhaustion pooled behind my eyes. That's it. I breathed, half laugh, half sob. All taken care of. Relief swept through me like spring floodwater, knocking loose the final boulders of dread. I could already picture him lumbering through melted meadows, bandages fraying against budding lupin, proof that kindness travels miles on 4 great paws. I truly believed our extraordinary exchange had reached its gentle conclusion, believed he would thank me with a parting glance, turn toward the door, and vanish into the bright Wyoming morning. But nature was not finished weaving its astonishments, and the next heartbeat would unveil a wonder I never thought the world contained. The clinic fell into a hush so absolute I could hear melting snow drip from the gutter outside. Single notes on a roof already warming to spring. The bear remained where I'd finished with him, haunches folded, front paws, one white-gauzed, one green-wrapped, resting like relics on the polished tile. His bulk blocked the doorway, yet he didn't seem caged by 4 walls. Rather, the building felt absorbed into the slow orbit of his presence, as though the wilderness had expanded to include fluorescent lights and disinfectant. Minutes stretched. I found myself afraid to breathe too audibly, worried even the rasp of my coat sleeve might fracture whatever fragile equation held us in balance. My heart, freed from battle drum panic, now beat a quieter, strangely resonant rhythm, thump pause, matching the deep bellows of the animal's lungs. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if a stethoscope pressed to his chest would echo the same cadence I felt in my own. He didn't blink often. When he did, the lid slid down in slow-motion solemnity, like cathedral doors closing on a secret. The stillness was not vacancy, but saturated with intention, as if every molecule between us hummed with words neither tongue could form. I tried cataloging clinical observations, respiration rate, stance symmetry, anything to anchor me in the known. Instead, my thoughts drifted outward, swelling with the impossible knowledge that a wild grizzly chose to sit with me in silence. The weight of that miracle pressed until it needed sound to vent or else crack my ribs. I swallowed. "You're a marvel, you know that?" The whisper barely left my lips, yet it felt thunderous in the hush. My cheeks flushed with the childishness of speaking to something that had never read meaning into syllables, or so I'd been taught my whole career. But the bear turned his head. Not a casual swivel, rather a deliberate recentering of focus, eyes sliding from middle distance to lock onto mine. Dark pupils widened, reflecting slanted bars of overhead light. In that gaze I read neither confusion nor threat but attentiveness, the way an old ranch dog tilts an ear to catch its name. The gesture sent a jolt, electric, luminous, up my spine. If recognition can leap species, then in that instant it vaulted the gap in a single bound. I felt the edges of my identity blur, as if I'd stepped beyond the clinic's chart-filled universe into a larger geography where titles, doctor, human, predator, prey, meant less than the bare fact of shared existence. The bear's eyes held me there, anchored yet unmoored, and a realization bloomed in the back of my skull. I am witnessing the living marrow of connection itself. No lecture hall, no wildlife documentary had prepared me for the visceral truth that understanding can pass from beast to man without translation. I remembered every lecture on maintaining dominance around large carnivores, loud voice, upright posture, no displays of weakness. Yet instinct told me to do the opposite. I eased onto the cool floor, crossing my legs, lowering my head in weary gratitude. "Thank you," I breathed, not fully sure for what: his trust, his restraint, the revelation offered by his composure. My words tasted inadequate, brittle as dry twigs beside the towering spruce of his quiet. He exhaled, a sound like wind rolling through canyon pines. The muscles along his shoulders slackened, subtle, but I read it: acceptance, maybe even the ursine echo of a sigh. His nose twitched twice, drawing in the sterile clinic air as though mapping my scent into the atlas of his memory. For one shimmering heartbeat, I forgot bills, voicemail, the schedule taped beside exam room 2. Forgot my species. I was simply a pulse in the same wide body of life that carried his. Awe unfurled inside me, warm, terrifying, irresistible. I am part of something bigger, the thought surfaced, clear as alpine water. It wasn't sentiment, it was biological certainty, a click of puzzle pieces once scattered by fear. The clock on the wall finally ticked loud enough to remind me it existed. Time resumed its crawl. Reality recoalesced. A veterinary lobby, a 600-pound carnivore, a human kneeling amid discarded gauze. Practicalities elbowed their way back. Fish and game reports, possible press, the risk of tranquilizer oversight if infection worsened. I drew a steadying breath and rose, joints popping. "That's everything," I said, a little louder than before, gesturing again toward open daylight beyond the glass door. The bear's ears angled toward the sound of birds outside, a flicker of longing in their forward tilt. Now he'll go, I thought, relief and melancholy braided tight. He shifted weight onto his bandaged paws, muscles rippling beneath thick spring coat, and I stepped back to clear his path. But he paused, head half-turned toward me, hesitation carved in the line of his spine. I'd been certain the chapter had closed, yet the bear lingered as if the story itself refused to lift its pen from the page, holding breath for one final stroke of wonder still to come. I stepped around the bear and pressed the panic bar. The clinic's glass door sighed open, spilling a blade of cold morning light across the lobby floor. Outside, the distant Tetons wore a soft blush of alpenglow, and the air smelled of thawing spruce. Clean, wild, irresistible. I held the door wide with one shoulder, half expecting the sudden rush of scent to snap whatever spell bound us and propel him forward. Behind me came the scrape of claws on tile. He rose slowly, deliberately, the way a boulder might decide, after a century, to continue rolling downhill. His bandaged paws tested weight. First the green-wrapped one, then the white. Satisfied, he moved, each stride a silent punctuation mark that made the fluorescent fixtures flicker as if humbled. When he reached the threshold, he halted. Sunlight cut a golden stripe across his muzzle, igniting the silver of old scars and turning the coarse fur at his neck into a shimmering mane. Steam curled from his nostrils like incense. The world on the far side of the doorway waited. Open hills, snow-dappled sage, the winding ribbon of Flat Creek glinting between cottonwoods. But he did not cross. Instead, he turned. The rotation was unhurried, purposeful, as though he wanted every fractional degree to register in my memory for the rest of my life. Our gazes locked one final time, and the room around us dissolved. No reception desk, no blood-specked gauze, no ticking clock. Only two living beings tethered by a moment so fragile a breath might shatter it. I searched for words to match the gravity in his eyes and found none. Language shrank like wool in hot water. The human lexicon keeps no neat drawer for expressions of ursine comprehension. Yet I felt the full weight of what shone there. Pain acknowledged, help received, an ancient ledger momentarily balanced. Was it wisdom? Gratitude? Some deep well of shared recognition we've forgotten how to drink from? I honestly didn't know. I only knew that whatever flowed between us felt more lucid than anything printed in a medical journal. Then, so slight I might have missed it if my heart hadn't been listening, he dipped his head. Not a bow, exactly, but the gentle forward incline you give a friend on a trail when words aren't needed. A nod, an amen, a benediction carried on fur and breath instead of syllables. My throat tightened. I wanted to reach out, to touch that great crown of bone and muscle, to etch the warmth into my palms before he vanished. But reverence pinned my arms to my sides. Some distances must remain untouched to stay sacred. He faced the opening again. One step placed his forepaws on concrete. The next brought the full arc of his body into the open air. The rising sun lit the bandages like bright sashes on a warrior returning from pilgrimage. He moved down the short ramp, paws whispering over frost, then lumbered across the parking lot toward the tree line where early light dappled trunks in bronze. Halfway to the pines he paused. I thought he might glance back, but he only lifted his muzzle and tasted the wind, as though charting invisible currents to carry him home. Then the forest accepted him. First shoulders, then haunches, finally that broad head fading between trunks, and the clearing stood bare except for a few drifting snow flurries. Silence rushed in behind him. I let the door ease shut and leaned against the frame, heartbeat rattling like trapped birds inside my chest. Gone was the adrenaline that had kept my limbs precise. In its wake surged something wilder, joy laced with grief, awe edged with panic, gratitude undercut by a fear I hadn't felt since childhood. The terror that the miraculous might leave and never return. I pressed fingers to my sternum, surprised to feel it thudding so hard it hurt. Back to work, I tried telling myself. Patients would arrive soon. A shepherd with hip dysplasia, a barn cat due for vaccines, familiar problems solvable by familiar means, inventory to reorder, phone calls to return, normalcy waiting like an obedient dog on the other side of a screen door. But my body refused command. knees unhinged. I sank onto the lobby bench, lab coat smeared with drying blood, eyes fixed on the empty doorway as if the bear's silhouette still glowed there. Every tick of the clock tolled like a bell in a cathedral suddenly too small for the faith that filled it. Work could wait. Charts could wait. The known world could wait. My heart was out there somewhere, lumbering beneath a coat of brown and bandages, carrying a piece of me into the vast, echoing hush of the forest. I thought naively that once he left I'd fold back into routine, sterilize instruments, maybe joke about the morning with Marcy when she arrived. But as the minutes crept by, I realized the door he'd walked through wasn't the only one that had opened. Something inside my chest had swung wide, too, and whatever rushed through it refused to be shut again. Evening draped itself over Jackson like a wool blanket, muting colors, muffling sounds. The clinic's windows glowed lamplight onto the dark street while wet tire tracks stitched silver lines through lingering slush. Inside, we gathered Marcy, Jonah, Dr. Perez from the equine practice down the road, 2 wildlife officer friends who'd raced over the second my shaky voicemail cracked into their dispatch line. Everyone stood in a loose semicircle around the lobby, eyes flicking from the gouges the bear's claws had left in the tile to the faint smear of blood on the reception counter. Nobody spoke at first. Silence had followed the animal out the door and refused to leave. I perched on the exam room stool, coat still stained, bandages rust-brown in the trash bin beside me, and tried to tell it straight. He came in at 7:05, sat there. I pointed to the scuffed square of floor, held out the paw, let me cut the trap, then offered the other. My throat tightened. Ridiculous how tears threatened now, when claws no longer hung inches from my jugular. He bowed, honest to God bowed, and walked out. Marcy's brows knit into the skeptical arch I know from 20 years of Monday morning mastitis cases. You're saying no sedation? Not even meditamidine? I never gave it. I held up the untouched vial like contraband. Didn't need to. Jonah ran a hand through his hair, sending veterinary school curls into disarray. A grizzly voluntarily presented both paws for treatment, and sat still. The question sounded half accusation, half desperate hope. Yes, I heard the word leave my lips, felt it thud against the collective incredulity, and still doubted it myself. My chest fluttered, tiny hummingbird palpitations. Each time memory replayed the moment he extended the uninjured paw. Impossible, yet the imprint was sharper than any photograph. Officer Dale crouched to inspect a droplet of blood. Trap wounds this deep would cripple most bears. You're sure he walked out weight-bearing? Watched every step, I said. Green wrap on the right, white on the left, both touching ground. Even now, I saw the colors moving through morning sun like streamers on a parade charger. Dr. Perez folded her arms, voice softening from disbelief to reverence. Why your clinic? Why you? The question ricocheted inside my rib cage. I had asked myself the same all afternoon, scrubbing counters on autopilot, hands replaying the procedure while thoughts spun bigger rings. What vector of instinct, pain, geography, and chance led a wild grizzly to trust fluorescent lights and antiseptic over a riverbank mud bath? I could offer no clean hypothesis. I don't know, I answered, but he knew he was being helped. You could see it in his eyes. Marcy, clipboard clutched like a shield, whispered, "What did they look like?" I closed mine to summon the image. Deep brown, almost black, flecked amber when the light caught. But color isn't it. It was the steadiness. Like looking into, I groped for language, into old timber that's seen 100 winters and still stands. As the metaphor left my mouth, I half cringed. Yet no plainer words surfaced. The group exchanged glances hovering between wonder and rational duty. Officer Dale straightened, business reasserting itself. We'll post a notice, ask ranchers to keep an eye out for a bear with distinctive wraps. Might need follow-up if the sutures tear. Sutures, wraps, clinic protocol rushed in like cold air, begging me to redress reality in familiar gowns. I nodded, grateful for tasks. Supply inventory, wound care instructions if he appeared again. Maybe sedation next time for safety. Still, practicality couldn't cauterize the swell inside my sternum. A tide rising every time the images flashed. Trap jaws parting, muzzle dipping in nod, paw against photo frame. My pulse skipped. Heat flooded then evaporated, leaving me shivering. "Doc!" Marcy's voice cut through. "You okay? You look pale." Each replay of the bear's gaze tightened a fist around my heart. Every detail glinted, steam curling from his nostrils. The halo of sun on scarred fur, the quiet dignity of his bow, and with each loop my chest fluttered anew, muscles tensing as if bracing for a claw that never came. "I'm fine," I lied, rubbing sternum with thumb knuckle. Just adrenaline echo. But it was more than that. It was the seismic aftershock of knowing the world had slipped its leash, revealed a depth I'd never suspected. All afternoon, between routine vaccinations and an abscessed molar, I'd caught myself staring at the timberline outside the window, half expecting a brown form to materialize, half fearing it might and uproot me from the comfort of disbelief. Jonah broke the hush. "If this goes to press, skeptics will roast us." "Videos? Security cameras?" Marcy gasped, lunging for the monitor. We rewound footage, hearts vaulting. At 7:05 the doorway camera flickered, just the tail end of a brown blur squeezing through frame, then glitched to black. The lobby camera played static until 7:47, when it cleaned up in time to capture me mopping the floor. Power surge? The universe covering its own tracks? Whatever the cause, the bear remained a phantom in pixels. Officer Dale exhaled through his teeth. "So we have only your testimony and claw marks. Call it what you want," I said, surprising myself with the edge in my voice. "I call it fact." Their skepticism didn't anger me. It reflected the one that still rattled inside my own skull. As they filed out into dusk, promises of reports and follow-ups trailing like cold breath, I stayed seated on the stool, staring at the dark doorway beyond which night thickened. The clinic fell quiet. Fluorescence hummed overhead. Kennels whispered with sleeping cats. I rested elbows on knees, head in hands, and let the film spool again. The grizzly's massive shape filling the entrance, the soft set of his haunches, the wounded paw extended over tile like an olive branch. The second paw offered not in pain but in trust. The nod, the exit, the bandaged figure swallowed by trees. With each frame my heart lurched. Thump, stutter, thump, until I pressed a palm flat against my sternum as if to steady the organ itself. "Can't be," reason insisted, still kicking at the door. "Bears don't seek doctors. Bears don't bow." It happened, memory answered, stone solid and luminous. "You were there." The two voices clashed, sparks of disbelief lighting the cramped office until fatigue extinguished them. What remained was a quiet certainty that no peer-reviewed paper could dissect. I had glimpsed a seam in reality where wild trust seeped through, and nothing would stitch it closed again. I rose, flicked off the lobby lights, and stepped outside. The night smelled of pine resin and moonlit snow. Somewhere beyond the creek a lone owl called, no doubt hunting, but the sound carried the same hush that had filled our clinic. An echo of paws on tile, of silent understanding passing like current through two beating hearts. I looked toward the forest's black edge. My pulse fluttered once more, as it would, I suspected, every time memory replayed that nod, for the rest of my life. "It's impossible," I whispered to the dark. My breath fogged, drifted, vanished. But I saw it, and now I know. My voice cracked, then steadied on a truth too large for doubt. Nature is wiser than we are, far, far wiser, and I will spend whatever years I have left bowing back.